In 1848, a man named James Wilson Marshall found something in a California creek that changed everything. He was just a carpenter, working alongside John Sutter, a wealthy Swiss immigrant who had built an empire in the Sacramento Valley. Marshall wasn't there looking for fortune. He was there doing his job, building a sawmill on the South Fork of the American River in a place called Coloma. But on the morning of January 24, 1848, while he was inspecting the tail race, the channel that drained water away from the mill's water wheel, something caught his eye. He saw something glinting in the sandy bottom of the ditch. He bent down, reached into the freezing water, and picked up a handful of soil. His heart stopped. What he held in his palm were tiny flakes of gold. Real gold. He knew it immediately. Later, Marshall would describe that moment. I picked up one or two pieces and examined them attentively. Having some general knowledge of minerals, I could not call to mind more than two which in any way resembled this. Iron, very bright and brittle, and gold, bright, yet malleable. He saw another flake, then another. James Marshall, a carpenter from New Jersey, had just triggered the largest mass migration in American history. What he discovered wasn't just gold. It was a lie. A profound, catastrophic, all-consuming lie that would lure 300,000 people across deserts, mountains, and endless oceans. A lie that promised fortune but delivered death, madness, and absolute ruin. And for most of them, the gold they sought was never real. They never found it. But what they left behind, what America has been hiding for 175 years, is a dark secret about who really profited, who really suffered, and the violence that built a nation's mythology. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, here's what we're uncovering today, and I warn you, the answers will reshape how you think about American history. If gold was so easy to find, why did 99% of prospectors walk away with nothing? Who really got rich during the gold rush? And I mean really rich, not the desperate miners covered in mud, working 18-hour days, losing fingernails to frozen streams, but the men who saw an opportunity where others saw hope. Why did the most famous gold discoveries happen at the very beginning, in 1848 and 1849, when a prospector could find 10 to 15 times the daily wage of a laborer back east in just a single day of panning? But by 1850, when the real rush began, when 100,000 people arrived in a single year, the easy gold was already gone. Completely gone. What happened to those hundreds of thousands of men who sailed around Cape Horn, who crossed the Isthmus of Panama through disease-infested jungles, who walked across deserts so hostile they later named it Death Valley, because 13 prospectors died trying to cross it? Where are they in this story? And why are historians just now admitting that the greatest migration in American history was built entirely on broken promises and invisible wealth that almost nobody ever found? There was gold in California. Yes, absolutely. But by the time most people arrived, it wasn't waiting in the riverbeds. It was already in someone's pocket. Someone else's pocket. To understand what happened, we need to travel back further than January 1848. We need to understand what America wanted in the 1840s. The nation was expanding westward with an intensity that bordered on obsession. It was deliberate. It was violent. It needed a narrative, a story that would justify taking Native American land, pushing out existing settlers, and creating a civilized frontier. The United States had just fought the Mexican-American War and won. In February 1848, just 9 days after James Marshall discovered gold in that mill's tail race, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. America had officially acquired California. But that huge territory was mostly empty to American eyes, and America needed settlers. America needed expansion. America needed manifest destiny. And what better story to tell millions of desperate people than this? Come west, find gold, become a millionaire, reinvent yourself as someone powerful and wealthy. It was the ultimate American fantasy, and it worked. It worked perfectly. But here's what they didn't tell you. The landscape of California wasn't empty at all. The Sierra Nevada mountains, the valleys, the rivers teeming with fish, they were already home to the Nisenan people, the Miwok, the Yokuts, the Maidu, the Pomo, and dozens of other indigenous nations who had lived there for over 10,000 years. These weren't primitive people stumbling around in the darkness. They had sophisticated agriculture, complex societies, trade networks that stretched for hundreds of miles, and they had absolutely no need for gold. To the indigenous peoples of California, gold was useless. It had no value. It couldn't be eaten. It couldn't make you warm. It was just a shiny rock. But when gold was found, everything changed for everyone. In just a few years, the Native American population in California would collapse from 150,000 people to 30,000. Not primarily from disease, though disease killed thousands, but from systematic violence. From what historians now call genocide, though Americans at the time called it progress. When James Marshall showed John Sutter those first gold flakes, Sutter immediately understood the danger. He tried to keep it secret. He asked his workers, including some Mormon laborers working on the mill, to stay quiet. But keeping a secret of that magnitude was impossible. One of those workers, a Mormon named Samuel Brannan, heard about the gold. Samuel Brannan was a merchant, not a miner. He was smart enough to see what was coming. He bought up all the mining equipment he could find in San Francisco. Picks, shovels, pans, blankets, rope, anything a prospector might need. He charged enormous prices. When a miner came to his store, desperate for supplies, Brannan sold a shovel for $50. The actual cost was $1. He made $1,600 in a single day, which is equivalent to about $48,000 in modern money. Then in May 1848, Brannan did something brilliant and calculating. He walked through San Francisco holding up a vial of gold, shouting gold, gold from the American River. He created hysteria. He manufactured frenzy. He turned possibility into desperation, and he did it for a reason. Because every person who became frenzied, every person who rushed to buy his supplies or his land, made Samuel Brannan richer. Brannan didn't die as a regular businessman. He died as California's first millionaire. News of the gold discovery spread slowly at first. Remember, there were no telegraph lines connecting California to the East Coast. No railroads. No fast communication. News had to travel by ship, either south around Cape Horn at the tip of South America, a journey taking 6 or 7 months, or across the dangerous Isthmus of Panama, where cholera and yellow fever killed thousands. In December 1848, President James K. Polk officially announced the gold discovery in his State of the Union address to Congress. That's when everything changed. That official presidential confirmation was like striking a match near gasoline. Within weeks, within days, every newspaper on the East Coast ran the same headline: Gold in California. Thousands of men sold everything they owned. They mortgaged their homes. They borrowed money from family. They imagined themselves becoming wealthy beyond measure, striking it rich, leaving their ordinary lives behind forever. By 1849, approximately 90,000 people were heading to California. The newspapers called them the 49ers because they migrated in 1849. Most were American, but tens of thousands came from Mexico, Chile, Peru, China, Europe, and Australia. They came on ships, on wagons, through mountains and deserts. Some took the sea route around Cape Horn. 6 to 8 months of seasickness, scurvy, and shipboard disease. Others tried the shortcut across Panama. 6 weeks of jungle, but with yellow fever and dysentery waiting at the other end. 1 in 12 of these men died before they even arrived in California. That's thousands of corpses in mass graves in tropical ports. Thousands of men who never even saw the gold fields, but who were already victims of the dream. The first prospectors to arrive in 1848 and early 1849 actually did find gold. Significant amounts. Those early arrivals, the 48ers, could collect large amounts of easily accessible gold. Some men worked for 6 months and found the equivalent of 6 years' wages from back home. A man could work in a river for a day and collect $20 in gold, which back on the East Coast would take 2 weeks of labor to earn. These early stories of success spread like wildfire. Magazines printed them. Newspapers republished them. Families discussed them at dinner tables. Letters arrived from California written by these lucky few, describing their newfound wealth. Those letters were the fuel that drove hundreds of thousands of desperate people to spend everything they had and risk their lives. But here's what nobody told them: that gold was already gone by the time they arrived. The rivers had been picked clean. The creeks that had given up so much wealth in weeks were now producing nothing. By the time most people arrived in California, they discovered something shocking. You couldn't just walk up to a river and find gold anymore. You needed capital. You needed equipment, not picks and pans, but hydraulic mining systems, sluice boxes, organized operations. You needed to dig deep into the earth, not pan shallow water. You needed to mine with other men, which meant you had to have money to organize them and pay them. Most prospectors had nothing. They had spent everything getting there. By 1850, surface gold in California was essentially exhausted. All the easy gold was gone, but the news hadn't reached America yet. Tens of thousands of new arrivals kept coming, believing the stories from 2 years earlier. They arrived poor and desperate, and they found a landscape where all the best land was already claimed. They found mining regions that had been worked over multiple times. They found competition beyond anything they imagined. Mining became industrial. You couldn't succeed as an individual anymore. You had to work for larger mining companies or wealthy claim owners. You had to trade your labor for small wages while someone else took the majority of the gold. A typical prospector who arrived late to the gold rush had spent $1,000 to $2,000 getting there. That's equivalent to $30,000 to $60,000 in modern money. He'd spent months traveling through hell. He'd watched men die of cholera. He'd survived disease. He'd arrived exhausted and broke. And the statistical chance of him finding gold worth more than his initial investment was less than 5%. The average miner found nothing. 0. The lucky ones broke even. Most lost everything. San Francisco in 1850 was absolute chaos. It had grown from a sleepy settlement of around 1,000 people to a chaotic city of 40,000, with 4,000 more immigrants arriving by ship every single month. Abandoned ships cluttered the harbor because sailors were abandoning their vessels to go search for gold. Most of the available lumber was being used to build saloons instead of houses or hospitals. Citizens lived in cellars and makeshift tents crowded into the flatlands. Health conditions were frightful. 1/3 of all deaths were caused by diarrhea and dysentery. Malnutrition was common. Scurvy devastated mining camps. Malaria killed thousands. Typhus fever spread through the tent cities. In autumn of 1850, cholera arrived in San Francisco by ship, brought in by infected immigrants hoping to celebrate California's admission as a state. One physician observer estimated that from 1851 to 1853, 1 out of every 5 people reaching California died within 6 months of arrival. That's not a survival statistic. That's a death sentence. Prospectors suffered accidents constantly. They lost fingernails in frozen streams. They got shot accidentally. They suffered gangrene and amputation. A miner named Hiram Pierce, from Troy, New York, described attending a funeral for a young man from Maine who died of gangrene after carelessly shooting himself in the leg. These weren't isolated incidents. Death was everywhere. Lawlessness and crime exploded. Vigilante justice became the only law. Men were hanged from trees for crimes they may or may not have committed. Stealing was common because starvation was common. Towns with names like Hangtown, Sucker Flat, and Murderer's Bar appeared in mining regions, names given by the miners themselves, marking the violence and desperation inherent in the rush. The promise of gold had drawn more miners west every year, but those miners were arriving to find gold that didn't exist, land that was already claimed, and a reality that devastated most of them. And this is where the story makes a dramatic turn. This is where we discover the real truth of the gold rush. Who actually became wealthy? Who actually profited from this massive migration and all this suffering and death? The answer is not who you think. It wasn't the miners. It wasn't the prospectors covered in mud, working 18-hour days, freezing in rivers, dying from disease. The men who got rich weren't the men who found gold. They were the men who sold to the men who found, or tried to find, gold. This is the real story that's been hidden from you. Samuel Brannan, that merchant I mentioned earlier who created the frenzy with his vial of gold, he became a millionaire by selling supplies. But he understood something fundamental that most people missed. Supply selling was good, but it wasn't good enough. Real wealth came from other sources. Brannan moved into land speculation and banking. He bought property in Sacramento when it was just a muddy landing at a river junction, when land was basically worthless. Years later, that land was incredibly valuable. He also lobbied aggressively against California banning commercial banking, and he built a banking empire. By the time Brannan died, he had accumulated wealth beyond what any individual prospector could dream of. He had used the gold rush as a launching pad to something much bigger. Then there was Levi Strauss, a Bavarian immigrant who arrived in San Francisco in March 1853. Levi Strauss didn't come to pan for gold. He came to sell things. His brothers owned a dry goods business back in New York, and they sent him to California to establish a wholesale operation. He sold fabric, blankets, tools, supplies, everything miners needed. His business grew rapidly. But in the early 1870s, a tailor and customer named Jacob Davis approached Strauss with an idea. Davis had invented a way to reinforce work pants by adding brass rivets at stress points, particularly at pocket corners where the seams always tore. This innovation made the pants incredibly durable. Davis couldn't afford to patent the idea himself, so he came to Strauss for help. Strauss saw genius in the idea. He understood what would sell. They partnered together and patented riveted denim work pants. They called them waist-high overalls, but later they became known as Levi's jeans. Strauss and Davis couldn't sell them fast enough. Miners bought them, cowboys bought them, ranchers bought them, anyone doing hard labor bought them. The riveted pockets were legendary. Strauss eventually added an image of two horses trying to tear the jeans apart, a demonstration of their durability. The jeans became iconic. Levi Strauss died in 1902 with an estate worth nearly $6 million. That's equivalent to hundreds of millions in modern money. He became wealthy not by mining gold, but by selling pants and supplies to miners. John Studebaker followed a similar path. He came to California to make wagons for miners. He made wagons and became enormously wealthy. He later became a wagon and automobile manufacturer and built one of the great industrial fortunes in America, all beginning with the gold rush. Charles Girardelli arrived in California and started selling chocolate and supplies to miners. Girardelli became famous for his chocolate, and his company still exists today. It was founded on profits from the gold rush. Alfred Peabody brought cargo ships full of foodstuffs and tools to mining camps and made a fortune. Mrs. J.W. Lickens sold books and prints. Daniel Noer vended prefabricated houses. Mrs. D.B. Bates ran a hotel and boarding house serving miners. Between 1848 and 1850, a merchant named Charles F. Hotchkiss earned $23,000 selling merchandise in San Francisco and Stockton. That's equivalent to about $700,000 in modern money, and he did it in just 2 years. 2 years. A miner who spent his entire life digging in frozen streams might find $5,000 in gold, and that was exceptional. Most found nothing. This is where the myth completely falls apart. The gold rush was never about ordinary men becoming millionaires through hard work and luck. It was always about merchants, supply chains, and business. It was about seeing that when desperate people rush toward a dream, you don't sell the dream. You sell them the tools to chase it. You sell them false hope. As the saying went, in a gold rush, sell shovels. But the most successful people didn't just sell shovels. They sold food at 10 times normal price. They sold picks, pans, rope, blankets, clothing, housing, alcohol, women, opportunity, and false hope. They sold dreams in bottles, and dreams in cans, and dreams in letters back home, describing wealth they'd found. And then there were the railroad barons. As more people flooded toward California, the need to transport them became critical. The Panama Railway was created to transport 49ers across the Isthmus of Panama. 3 American businessmen, one of whom already ran steamship lines, created this railway with an initial investment of $1 million. The railway became incredibly profitable. It transported people, cargo, and most importantly, gold being returned from California. In just 10 years, the Panama Railway transported $500 million worth of California gold. The railway charged a cut of every transaction. When the line was completed in 1855, the company was already profitable. It became the most highly valued company on the New York Stock Exchange. The railway owners became wealthy beyond measure, not from mining or supplying miners, but from moving the infrastructure that made mining possible. Later, much later, there was the Transcontinental Railroad. Leland Stanford, Collis P. Huntington, Charles Crocker, and Mark Hopkins all became railroad barons and some of the wealthiest men in American history. Their wealth was built, indirectly, on the gold rush. The massive influx of population to California that the gold rush created demanded transportation, communication, and infrastructure. The railroads provided that, and the railroads made fortunes that dwarf anything a miner ever earned. John Sutter, the man whose property hosted the gold discovery, went bankrupt by 1852. His workers abandoned him to search for gold. Miners ate his livestock. Prospectors stole his equipment. His sawmill failed because there was no one to work it. Sutter himself died broke, spending his final years petitioning the government for compensation for losses caused by the gold discovery on his property. He never received it. He died having lost everything because of the very thing that should have made him wealthy. James Marshall, the carpenter who found it all, lived his life in poverty. He tried to stake claims in the gold fields, but was unsuccessful. He started a vineyard that eventually failed due to higher taxes and competition. He lived in obscurity and died in 1885, an old man of little means. The state of California didn't even erect a monument to him until 1890, 5 years after his death. That monument cost $9,000 and was funded by the state legislature, not by grateful miners or merchants. Marshall's own discovery had destroyed his life. He became the tragic irony of the gold rush. The man who found the gold became the man with nothing. Now we reach the part of the story that America hasn't wanted to tell you. Because understanding who profited isn't enough. We need to understand what happened to the people who didn't profit. We need to understand the violence. We need to understand what price was paid so that Levi Strauss could become a millionaire, so that Samuel Brannan could build a banking empire, so that railroad barons could expand their empires. That price was paid in the blood and suffering of millions. The largest price was paid by the people who were already there. The Nisenan, Miwok, Yokuts, Maidu, and dozens of other Native American nations of California had lived in that region for over 10,000 years. They had developed sophisticated cultures, specialized economies, and complex societies that worked in harmony with their environment. They fished the rivers. They gathered acorns and seeds. They hunted. They had no concept of private property, no concept of land ownership, no concept of gold's value. When the gold rush began, approximately 150,000 Native Americans lived in California. By 1870, that number had fallen to approximately 30,000. That's an 80% population collapse in less than 25 years. Over 100,000 people, men, women, children, elders, were dead. This wasn't primarily from disease, though disease killed many. This was from systematic violence. This was from intentional extermination that some California counties officially subsidized. Some counties offered bounties for Native American scalps. $5 per scalp. Prospectors killed indigenous people to claim their ancestral lands. Miners brutalized indigenous people to drive them away from areas where gold might be found. The violence was not incidental. It was policy. It was systematic. It was genocide. Historians now estimate that the California gold rush led to the deaths of as many as 120,000 Native Americans. That's more deaths than the entire American Civil War. But we don't teach it that way. We teach the gold rush as a triumph of American expansion, as progress, as civilization defeating wilderness. But there was another group of victims in the gold rush whose suffering was nearly as brutal, but has been almost entirely forgotten by history. The Chinese miners. Between 1848 and 1855, approximately 300,000 people came to California. Of those, roughly 90,000 arrived in 1849 alone. Beginning in 1849, Chinese miners began arriving in California, having heard that gold was available in Gold Mountain, as they called it. By 1852, more than 25,000 Chinese immigrants had arrived in California. By 1855, that number had grown significantly. The Chinese came hoping to make their fortunes, just like everyone else. They were good miners. They were hardworking. They were willing to work areas that American miners had given up on, believing those areas had been exhausted. But the Chinese discovered something. Those supposedly exhausted areas still contained gold. Chinese miners, working carefully and methodically, found rich deposits that American miners had missed or abandoned too quickly. If Chinese miners had been allowed to keep the gold they found, they would have become wealthy. But they weren't allowed. California's legislature passed the Foreign Miners Tax in 1850. This tax specifically targeted non-American miners and forced them to pay $20 per month to mine. That's an enormous sum for the time, equivalent to about $770 per month in modern money. It was intentionally designed to be prohibitively expensive, to drive foreign miners out so that American miners could access whatever gold remained. Chinese miners were the primary target. But there was a secondary problem. Even if Chinese miners managed to pay the tax and continue mining, they were legally barred from filing claims on property. Any gold they found belonged to their employers or to whoever controlled the land. Chinese miners couldn't own claims. They couldn't own their discoveries. They were systematically barred from ownership of anything valuable. When they found gold-rich areas, those areas were often stolen from them by American prospectors who would claim they had discovered them first. The Chinese miners worked in brutal conditions, for minimal pay, under constant threat of violence, with no legal protection and no way to accumulate wealth from their labor. American prospectors also engaged in organized violence against Chinese miners. As easily accessible gold became scarcer and scarcer, competition intensified. American miners began organized attacks on Chinese miners, driving them away from productive regions, stealing their equipment, and threatening them with death if they returned. The foreign miners' tax was enforcement, but it was also psychological warfare, a legal way to say to foreigners, "You're not welcome here, and we're going to make it as expensive as possible for you to stay." After the easy surface gold was gone, after the gold rush had peaked and begun to decline, the Chinese miners who remained were pushed into the worst conditions. Some became indentured servants. Some returned to China. Others stayed and eventually established themselves in American cities, becoming the foundation of Chinese-American communities in San Francisco and other Western cities. But their contribution to the gold rush, their discoveries, their labor, their suffering, was essentially erased from the historical record. Most Americans today have no idea that Chinese miners comprised up to 25% of the mining population at the height of the gold rush. Most Americans don't know that Chinese miners discovered some of the richest deposits in California. Most Americans don't know that the Chinese were systematically excluded from profiting from their own discoveries. The mythology of the gold rush was carefully constructed. Newspapers and penny dreadfuls published sensational stories of ordinary men striking it rich. Dime novels glorified the prospector as an independent, hard-working hero. Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, which started later in the 19th century, perpetuated these myths for audiences across America and Europe. The narrative was, the West was wild, there was opportunity for everyone, and men who worked hard could become wealthy. This mythology was so powerful, so appealing, so aligned with American ideals about individualism and opportunity, that it became how we actually understood the West. The real story, of systematic violence, of exploitation, of a few merchants becoming wealthy while millions suffered and died, was buried. It was hidden beneath layers of myth. Hollywood movies in the 20th century reinforced the mythology. TV shows romanticized frontier life. School textbooks taught the gold rush as a highlight of American expansion. For over 100 years, the myth was stronger than the truth. The myth was more profitable than the truth. The myth was what we wanted to believe about ourselves. But here's the thing that's most important to understand. The system that created the gold rush, the promise of opportunity concealing systematic exploitation, the promise of wealth for the many delivering wealth to the few, the use of mythology to hide the reality of violence and suffering. That system hasn't gone away. It's still here. It's still operating. The mechanisms have changed. The setting has changed. But the basic structure remains identical. We see it in the digital age with startups. We see it with cryptocurrency. We see it with social media influencers and the creator economy. Millions of people are told they can become wealthy by working hard, by creating content, by hustling. But the platform owners, the new Levi Strausses and Samuel Brannans, are the ones accumulating the real wealth. Most creators earn almost nothing. The top 1% of creators take the lion's share of earnings. But the system keeps encouraging mass participation because the platform companies profit from the engagement, from the advertising, from the attention. It's the same system, running on a different stage. The gold rush teaches us something fundamental about how power works, about how mythology operates, about how we tell ourselves stories that hide reality. The gold rush was presented to us as a tale of opportunity and individualism. But the actual story is a story of exploitation and violence and systematic extraction. It's a story about who gets wealthy when there's a rush, and the answer is, the people selling supplies, the people controlling transportation, the people holding the land, the people with capital and connections. It's not the desperate people doing the actual digging. So here's what